Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Gulf. August 2nd, 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin. The air is thick with salt and humidity, a suffocating blanket clinging to the gray steel of the American destroyer, the U.S. Maddox. The sun beats down on the flat, placid water, a shimmering mirror reflecting an empty sky. It is a lonely patrol, a routine show of force in waters claimed by North Vietnam, part of a covert intelligence mission codenamed DeSoto. The ship's commander, Captain John J. Herrick, feels a growing unease. His vessel is a symbol of American power, a dagger pointed at the heart of a burgeoning communist state, but out here it feels small, isolated. The ship cuts through the sea just over 10 miles from the North Vietnamese coast, a deliberate provocation in a region simmering with unspoken tensions. For months, the United States has been supporting secret South Vietnamese commando raids against the North. The men aboard the Maddox know this. They know they are bait, a lure to draw out a reaction, to test the resolve of an enemy they barely understand. The ship's powerful electronic sensors sweep the horizon, listening for whispers in the static, for any sign of hostile intent. The crew moves with practiced efficiency, but below the surface of their naval discipline, a current of anxiety runs deep. They are thousands of miles from home, sailing in the shadow of a conflict that has not yet been given a name. It is a ghost war, fought with spies, saboteurs, and advisors, but that is about to change. In the early afternoon, the ship's sonar operators detect the faint, rhythmic thrum of high-speed engines. 3 North Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats are closing in. Fast, they are small, agile vessels, hornets against the Maddox's bulk. On the bridge, Captain Herrick watches the radar signatures, his unease hardening into certainty. This is not a drill. The order is given. The ship's 5-inch guns swivel, their barrels glinting in the tropical sun. A warning shot is fired. A plume of white water erupting near the lead boat. There is no turning back. The North Vietnamese boats press their attack, their own guns chattering, spitting tracers across the water. Then, the chilling sight of torpedoes slicing through the waves, white wakes aimed at the Maddox's hull. Captain Herrick orders evasive maneuvers. The destroyer heeling over hard, its engines screaming. The torpedoes pass harmlessly by. Fighter jets, F-8 Crusaders, scream in from the nearby carrier, the U.S. Ticonderoga, their cannons tearing into the fragile wooden hulls of the P-4 Sul. The sea, so calm just minutes before, is now a chaotic tableau of smoke, gunfire, and explosions. One boat is sunk, the other 2 crippled, limping away toward the coast. The Maddox is largely unscathed. A single bullet hole its only scar. The immediate crisis is over. But the true danger has just begun. 2 nights later, on August 4th, the Maddox, now accompanied by the destroyer USS Turner Joy, is back on patrol. The weather has turned. A violent squall churns the Gulf into a black, chaotic mess. Rain lashes the decks, and the wind howls. In the Combat Information Center, a space bathed in the eerie green glow of radar screens, the operators are on edge. They are seeing things. Blips appear on the screens, fleeting and indistinct. Sonar operators report the sound of torpedoes in the water, 22 of them, they claim. The ship's gunners open fire, blasting away at the darkness, at targets they cannot see. For nearly 4 hours, the 2 destroyers twist and turn in the storm, firing hundreds of shells into the night, convinced they are fighting for their lives against a swarm of invisible assailants. Captain Herrick, struggling to make sense of the chaos, sends a flash message to Washington. "I'm convinced our force is being attacked." But as the storm subsides and dawn approaches, doubts begin to creep in. There is no wreckage, no bodies, no visual confirmation of any enemy vessels. The sonar reports are re-examined. The operators, young and inexperienced, may have been hearing the ship's own propeller beats reflecting off the rudder during sharp turns. The radar blips could have been weather effects, phantom signals created by the storm. Herrick sends a second, more cautious message. Freak weather effects on radar and over-eager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports, suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken. But it is too late. His first message has already landed in Washington, D.C., a spark thrown into a room filled with political gasoline. In the White House, President Lyndon Baines Johnson is facing an election. He needs to look strong, decisive. He cannot afford to be seen as soft on communism. The conflicting reports from the Gulf are confusing, but the initial dramatic account of an unprovoked attack is the one that seizes the imagination of his administration. The nuance, the doubt, the caution urged by the man on the scene, it is all swept aside by the powerful current of political necessity. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man who trusts numbers and data above all else, briefs the president. He presents the attack as a certainty, an undeniable act of aggression. He later admitted, decades after the fact, It's a hell of a way to run a war, to be making decisions on the basis of signals that you don't really understand. But in that moment, the narrative was set. Johnson went on national television that evening. His voice was grave, his tone resolute. He told the American people, "Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply." He spoke of open aggression on the high seas, portraying the incident not as a confused skirmish in a murky, undeclared war, but as a clear and unambiguous assault on the United States itself. He did not mention the covert raids. He did not mention the Maddox's provocative patrol. He did not mention Captain Herrick's subsequent doubts. He presented a simple story of American innocence and communist aggression, and with that story, he went to Congress, requesting the authority to use military force. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution sailed through, passed almost unanimously. It was not a declaration of war, but it was, as one senator would later call it, a functional equivalent. It gave the president a blank check, the power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Lyndon Johnson now had the power to wage a war without ever having to ask for one. The ghost in the Gulf, the phantom battle fought in a tropical storm, had become real. It had become the justification for sending hundreds of thousands of American boys to a country most of them couldn't find on a map. The longest, most painful chapter in modern American history was about to be written, based on a story that was at best a profound misunderstanding, and at worst, a deliberate deception. The nightmare was about to begin, and no one, not the president in the Oval Office, not the sailors and the destroyers, not the young men in small towns across America, could possibly imagine how deep it would go, or how long it would last. Chapter 2. The Roots of a Quagmire. To understand the fire that would consume Vietnam, one must first trace the embers back through centuries of history, to a land and a people forged in resistance. Vietnam's story is not one that begins with American helicopters. It begins with 1,000 years of struggle against Chinese domination, a struggle that embedded a fierce, unyielding nationalism deep within the Vietnamese soul. This was a nation of poets and warriors, of rice farmers who could become guerrilla fighters at a moment's notice. Their identity was defined by their refusal to be ruled by outsiders. In the mid-19th century, a new outsider arrived. French colonialists, armed with modern weapons and a sense of cultural superiority, carved Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, into a territory they called French Indochina. For nearly a century, they ruled with an iron fist, exploiting the land for its rubber and rice, imposing their language and their laws, and crushing any dissent with brutal efficiency. But the spirit of resistance, though dormant, was not dead. It was into this world of colonial oppression that a man named Nguyen Sinh Khong was born in 1890. He was a paradox, a frail, wispy figure, with a gentle demeanor who possessed a will of pure steel. He would travel the world, working as a cook's helper on a steamship, a pastry chef in London, a photo retoucher in Paris. He would absorb the revolutionary ideas, sweeping the globe: socialism, communism, nationalism. He would petition the great powers at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I, pleading for Vietnamese independence based on the very principles of self-determination they claimed to champion. He was ignored. He would adopt many names, but the one that history would remember was Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens. Ho Chi saw in communism not just an economic theory, but a practical blueprint for revolution. It offered a way to organize, to discipline, and to inspire a mass movement that could overthrow a colonial power. In 1941, as the world was engulfed in the flames of the Second World War, and France itself was occupied by Nazi Germany, Ho Chi Minh slipped back into Vietnam after 30 years of exile. In a cave near the Chinese border, he founded a revolutionary movement called the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. It was a broad nationalist front, uniting communists and non-communists under a single, powerful banner: independence. During the war, the Viet Minh fought against the Japanese, who had occupied Indochina. They rescued downed American pilots, and for a brief, strange moment, they were allies with the United States. American intelligence officers from the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, parachuted into their jungle camps, bringing weapons and training. They saw Ho not as a communist ideologue, but as a dedicated nationalist, a Vietnamese George Washington. One OSS officer described him as an awfully sweet guy. When the war ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945, a power vacuum emerged. Ho Chi Minh seized the moment. His Viet Minh forces marched into Hanoi, and on September 2, 1945, in a crowded city square, he stood before his people and proclaimed the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. His speech began with words that would have been deeply familiar to any American. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was quoting directly from the American Declaration of Independence. He was sending a message to the world, and specifically to the United States. He believed the Americans, with their own history of anti-colonial revolution, would support his cause. He was wrong. The world had changed. The ashes of World War II had given rise to a new global conflict, the Cold War. The United States, now the leader of the free world, saw the globe as a great chessboard in a struggle against Soviet communism. Nuance was lost. A nationalist with communist leanings was no longer a patriot. He was a pawn of Moscow. And France was a crucial American ally in the effort to rebuild Europe and contain the Soviet Union. Washington chose to back its ally. French troops returned to Indochina, determined to reclaim their lost colony. The war that followed the First Indochina War was a brutal 8-year struggle. The French held the cities, but the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant military strategist General Vo Nguyen Giap, controlled the countryside. Giap perfected the art of guerrilla warfare, turning the jungles and rice paddies into a deadly labyrinth for the French forces. He famously said, "The enemy is the sea, and our people are the water." The French were drowning. By 1954, the United States was bankrolling nearly 80% of the French war effort. They were not yet fighting, but they were deeply invested in the outcome. The war reached its devastating climax in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu. The French command, in a stunning act of hubris, decided to build a massive fortified airbase there, hoping to lure Giap's army into a conventional set-piece battle where superior French firepower could annihilate them. It was a trap, but the French had miscalculated who would be the hunter and who would be the prey. General Giap did the impossible. He had tens of thousands of peasant volunteers dismantle heavy artillery pieces and drag them, piece, by hand, up the steep, jungle-covered mountains surrounding the valley. They reassembled the guns in concealed positions, looking down on the French garrison. When the Viet Minh opened fire in March of 1954, the French were caught completely by surprise. Their airstrip was destroyed, their positions relentlessly pounded. The siege of Dien Bien Phu became a 56-day nightmare of mud, blood, and despair. The French pleaded for American air support, even suggesting the use of tactical nuclear weapons. President Dwight D. Eisenhower considered it, but ultimately refused to intervene without support from other allies, particularly the British, who wanted no part of it. On May 7, 1954, the shattered, exhausted French garrison surrendered. The victory was a thunderclap that echoed across the colonized world. A small agrarian Asian nation had defeated a modern European military power. The French Empire in Indochina was finished. The following day, peace talks began in Geneva, Switzerland. The resulting Geneva Accords were a messy compromise. Vietnam was to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The communist Viet Minh would control the north, with its capital in Hanoi. A non-communist, Western-backed government would be established in the south, with its capital in Saigon. The division was meant to be temporary. A nationwide election was scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. But the Americans knew that in a free and fair election, Ho Chi Minh, the hero of the revolution, would win in a landslide. President Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs, "I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indochinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh. The United States could not allow that to happen. The election was never held. Instead, America threw its support behind an anti-communist nationalist named Nung Ngo Dinh Diem to lead the new state of South Vietnam. The temporary dividing line of the 17th parallel hardened into a permanent fortified border, another front line in the Cold War. The stage was set for a new conflict, a Vietnamese civil war that would be fueled and transformed by superpower intervention. The seeds of a quagmire had been sown in the soil of colonialism, watered by the Cold War, and were now beginning to sprout. America, believing it was preventing a communist takeover, was instead stepping into the same trap that had ensnared the French, inheriting a war against a deeply rooted nationalist movement. It fundamentally misunderstood. The path to America's longest nightmare was now paved. Chapter 3. The Dominoes Fall. In the years following the Geneva Accords, the United States set about building a new nation from scratch in southern Vietnam. The policy was driven by a powerful and persuasive idea, the domino theory. As articulated by President Eisenhower, it was the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, its neighbors, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, would inevitably topple one after another. like a row of dominoes, until the entire region was lost to the free world. South Vietnam was to be the finger in the dike, the critical domino that had to be held upright at all costs. The man chosen to hold it was Ngo Dinh Diem. On the surface, he seemed like a perfect choice. He was a staunch anti-communist and a fervent nationalist who had refused to cooperate with either the French or the Viet Minh. He was also a devout Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, a fact that would have profound consequences. With massive amounts of American aid and the guidance of CIA advisors, Diem began to consolidate his power. He brutally crushed his political rivals, from criminal syndicates to religious sects, and in a rigged referendum in 1955, he deposed the former emperor, Bao Dai, and declared himself the first president of the Republic of Vietnam. The early years of his rule brought a degree of stability, but Diem's government was built on a foundation of sand. He was an autocrat, ruling with an iron fist, tolerating no dissent. His administration was notoriously corrupt, dominated by his own family members, particularly his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and Nhu's sharp-tongued influential wife, Madame Nhu. They created a secret police force that jailed and executed thousands of suspected communists and other opponents. Diem's policies alienated vast segments of the South Vietnamese population. His land reform program was a disaster, returning land to wealthy landlords that the Viet Minh had previously distributed to the peasants. This struck at the very heart of rural life and drove countless peasants into the arms of the communists, who promised land and social justice. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership initially pursued a strategy of political struggle in the south, hoping the Diem regime would collapse under the weight of its own unpopularity. But as Diem's repression intensified, they changed course. In 1959, they authorized the resumption of armed struggle. They began to send weapons and trained cadres south along a network of jungle trails that would become legendary, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A new revolutionary movement emerged in the south, the National Liberation Front, or NLF. Diem and the Americans called them the Viet Cong, a derogatory term for Vietnamese communists. The Viet Cong were a formidable force. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, living among the people, indistinguishable from the ordinary peasant. They launched a campaign of assassinations against Diem's village chiefs and government officials, systematically dismantling his authority in the countryside. By night, much of rural South Vietnam belonged to them. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he inherited a rapidly deteriorating situation. Kennedy was a firm believer in the domino theory, deeply concerned about appearing weak in the face of communist expansion, especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba. He saw Vietnam as a test of American resolve. He famously declared that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. In Vietnam, this meant a significant escalation of American involvement. Kennedy rejected the idea of sending combat troops, fearing it would lead to a quagmire like the one the French had faced. Instead, he opted for a strategy of counterinsurgency. He dramatically increased the number of American military advisors, from under 1,000 in 1961 to over 16,000 by the end of 1963. These advisors were there to train and equip the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. American Green Berets were sent into the highlands to work with indigenous tribes. American helicopters were provided to give the ARVN mobility, allowing them to strike at Viet Cong strongholds. One of the cornerstone policies of this era was the Strategic Hamlet Program. The idea, backed by the CIA, was to isolate the rural population from the Viet Cong. Peasants were forcibly relocated from their ancestral villages into new fortified hamlets, surrounded by moats and barbed wire. The goal was to provide security and win their hearts and minds with promises of schools and medical care. But in practice, it was a catastrophe. The peasants resented being uprooted from their homes and the graves of their ancestors. The hamlets often felt more like concentration camps. The program was rife with corruption, and the Viet Cong frequently infiltrated them, turning a policy meant to provide security into a source of intelligence and recruits. The war was not going well. The ARVN, despite its American equipment and training, was often poorly led, unmotivated, and reluctant to engage the enemy. The Viet Cong were growing stronger. The reports coming back to Washington were often filtered through a lens of official optimism. The metrics of success, weapons captured, enemy killed, painted a rosy picture that bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. But the fatal flaw in the American strategy remained Diem himself. His oppressive rule was becoming an ever greater liability. The breaking point came in the summer of 1963. Diem, a Catholic, began a brutal crackdown on the country's Buddhist majority. He banned the flying of the Buddhist flag, and his troops fired on a crowd of peaceful protesters in the city of Hue. killing 9 people. The Buddhists responded with a powerful campaign of non-violent resistance. On June 11, 1963, on a busy street in Saigon, a 73-year-old monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down in the lotus position, had fellow monks douse him with gasoline, and set himself on fire. The photograph of his self-immolation, a silent, searing protest against the Diem regime, was published on the front pages of newspapers around the world. It was a profound shock to the American conscience. More monks would follow his example. Madame Nu, with characteristic callousness, dismissed the acts as barbecues and offered to supply the gasoline and matches. The Kennedy administration was horrified. Diem had become a public relations disaster, a tyrant who was undermining the very cause he was supposed to be leading. Privately, Kennedy's advisors were deeply divided. Some argued that there was no alternative to Diem. Others believed he had to go. A group of ARVN generals began plotting a coup. They secretly contacted the American embassy, seeking to know what the U.S. position would be. The new American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., received a fateful cable from Washington. It stated that the United States could no longer support Diem, and that if he did not remove his brother Nu from power, the U.S. would be prepared to see him go. It was a green light for the coup. On November 1, 1963, the generals made their move. They seized key installations in Saigon and surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and his brother Nu managed to escape through a secret tunnel, but were captured the next morning. They were put in the back of an armored personnel carrier, and on the way to military headquarters, they were assassinated. In Washington, President Kennedy was stunned and deeply troubled by the news. He had not explicitly ordered their deaths, but he knew the United States was complicit. He had helped unleash a whirlwind. The coup, which was supposed to bring stability and a more effective government, did the opposite. South Vietnam plunged into a period of chaos and political instability. A succession of military juntas followed, each one as corrupt and ineffective as the last. The Viet Cong took full advantage of the power vacuum in Saigon, rapidly expanding their control over the countryside. Just 3 weeks after Diem's assassination, on November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. The man who had vowed to pay any price was gone. The presidency, and the rapidly escalating crisis in Vietnam, now fell to his vice president, a man who would be consumed by the war, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The dominoes were falling not in Southeast Asia, but in Washington. Each decision, each escalation made with the intention of securing a victory, was only pulling the United States deeper into the quagmire. The path taken by Eisenhower and Kennedy had led to a dead end. And now Lyndon Johnson stood at a crossroads, facing a choice between a humiliating withdrawal and a massive open-ended American war. Chapter 4. A War of Two Worlds. The Vietnam War was not just a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds, of ideologies, of histories, and of men whose personal convictions would shape the fate of millions in Washington, D.C. The war was conceived in the sterile, air-conditioned corridors of power, a conflict managed by statistics, charts, and maps. At the center of this world was Lyndon Baines Johnson, a man of immense ambition and insecurity, a Texan of towering physical presence and even greater political skill. Johnson was a master of domestic policy. His dream was to build the Great Society, a sweeping program of social reforms that would rival Roosevelt's New Deal. He wanted to be remembered for Medicare, for civil rights, for the war on poverty. Vietnam was a distraction, a frustrating, piddling little war that threatened to derail his grand vision. Yet he felt trapped by it. He had inherited Kennedy's commitment, and he was a disciple of the Cold War gospel. He profoundly feared being seen as the president who lost Vietnam to communism, a charge that had crippled the Truman administration after the fall of China. He once confided to an aide, "I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. It's just the biggest damn mess I ever saw." This internal conflict defined his presidency. He would lie awake at night, tormented by casualty lists, yet he would publicly project an image of unwavering resolve. He saw the conflict in deeply personal terms, as a test of his own manhood and of America's credibility. "We are not about to be run out of Vietnam," he vowed. He surrounded himself with a team of advisors, often called the best and the brightest, men of immense intellect and confidence, who had served under Kennedy. There was Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, a former president of Ford Motor Company. McNamara was a brilliant systems analyst who believed that any problem could be solved if you could gather enough data. He approached the war like a business equation, a problem of logistics and resource management. He was obsessed with metrics: body counts, sorties flown, bombs dropped. He believed he could quantify the path to victory. But the war in Vietnam was a war of intangibles, of will, of belief, of patience. that could not be entered into a spreadsheet. His certitude masked a growing private doubt, a moral agony that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Then there was General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, a handsome, square-jawed soldier who looked like he had stepped out of a recruiting poster. Westmoreland was a product of the American military's conventional mindset. He had fought in World War II and Korea, wars of front lines and clear objectives. He sought to fight the same kind of war in Vietnam. His strategy was one of attrition. He believed that if he could just kill enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced, he would eventually reach a crossover point where the enemy would lose the will to fight. This led to the infamous search and destroy missions, where American troops would sweep through the countryside, trying to force the enemy into a stand-up fight and measuring success by the number of bodies left behind. This strategy turned the war into a brutal, grinding machine, but it failed to account for the enemy's seemingly limitless capacity to endure loss. Across the world, in Hanoi, a different group of men were waging a different kind of war. Their world was not one of polished mahogany and ticker tapes, but of jungle camps and peasant huts. Their leader was Ho Chi Minh. By the 1960s, he was an elder statesman, the revered. Chapter 5. The Point of No Return. The year 1964 ended with South Vietnam in a state of near collapse. The government in Saigon was a revolving door of inept generals, and the Viet Cong were on the offensive across the country. Lyndon Johnson, having just won a landslide presidential election, was now free from the immediate pressures of campaigning. He had his mandate, and he had his great society to build, but the specter of Vietnam loomed over everything. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution had given him the authority to act, but he had so far been reluctant to take the fateful step of committing America to a full-scale ground war. He knew the risks. He remembered the French experience. He feared a bloody quagmire that would drain the nation's resources and political will. He was caught in a terrible dilemma. His advisors presented him with three options. He could withdraw, which he saw as a humiliating defeat that would shatter American credibility worldwide. He could continue the current policy of limited aid and advisory support, a policy that was clearly failing. Or he could escalate, taking direct military control of the war. The internal debates within the Johnson administration during late 1964 and early 1965 were intense and agonizing. Under-Secretary of State George Ball was one of the few dissenting voices. He was a Cassandra, warning Johnson with remarkable prescience of the dangers ahead. In a series of memos, he argued that a major escalation would be a historic mistake. He wrote, "Once on the tiger's back, we cannot be sure of picking the place to dismount." He predicted a protracted, inconclusive war that would cost thousands of American lives and turn the American public against the government. He warned that the jungles of Vietnam would swallow an American army of 500,000 men or more. But the majority of Johnson's advisors, McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, argued for escalation. They were men of action, can-do problem solvers who believed in the efficacy of American power. They argued that a limited, carefully calibrated application of force could break Hanoi's will. They believed that North Vietnam, a fourth-rate, raggedy-ass little country, as Johnson once called it, could not stand up to the might of the United States. They proposed a program of sustained bombing of North Vietnam to cripple its ability to support the insurgency in the South. The trigger for this escalation came on February 7, 1965. Viet Cong guerrillas launched a surprise mortar attack on a U.S. military advisor's compound at Camp Holloway, near the city of Pleiku in the Central Highlands. 8 Americans were killed and over 100 were wounded. McGeorge Bundy happened to be in Saigon at the time, on a fact-finding mission. He flew to Pleiku and saw the carnage firsthand. The sight of wounded American soldiers being carried from the wreckage had a powerful effect on him. He sent a cable to Johnson, arguing for immediate and forceful retaliation. He wrote that the current policy was headed toward disaster, and that without new U.S. action, defeat appears inevitable. Johnson needed no further convincing. The attack at Pleiku was the justification he had been waiting for. He saw it as a direct challenge to American honor. He reportedly said, "I've had enough of this." He immediately authorized a retaliatory airstrike, and 3 days later, he gave the green light for a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was supposed to be a short, sharp campaign, lasting perhaps a few weeks. It was designed to send a signal to Hanoi, to persuade them to cease their support for the Viet Cong. It would last for more than 3 years. American bombers, 405s, B-52s, pounded North Vietnamese military targets, bridges, railways, and industrial sites. The campaign was tightly controlled from Washington. Johnson himself sometimes boasted of picking the targets, determined to avoid a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. But the bombing failed to achieve its strategic objectives. North Vietnam was not a highly industrialized nation. It had few high-value targets. The damage was quickly repaired by legions of peasant laborers, and instead of breaking Hanoi's will, the bombing hardened it. It rallied the North Vietnamese people around their government and fueled their determination to resist. Ho Chi Minh declared, "They can burn the whole Truong Son mountain range, but they cannot defeat us." The bombing also created a new problem. The airbase at Da Nang, from which many of the bombing raids were launched, was vulnerable to Viet Cong attack. General Westmoreland argued that he could not protect the base with South Vietnamese troops, whom he did not trust. He needed American combat troops to provide security. On March 8, 1965, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines, 3,500 men, waded ashore on the beaches of Da Nang. Their arrival was a carefully stage-managed media event. They were met by a group of smiling Vietnamese schoolgirls who placed garlands of flowers around their necks. The Marines looked bewildered. They were trained for combat, but they were being greeted as if they were tourists. The public was told that their mission was strictly defensive, limited to protecting the airbase, but this was a fiction. It was the first irrevocable step in the Americanization of the war. Once American boys were on the ground, the logic of the situation changed. They became a target. They had to be protected, and the best way to protect them, the military argued, was to go out and find and kill the enemy before the enemy could attack them. The defensive mission quickly evolved into an offensive one. In the months that followed, the floodgates opened. Johnson, still hoping to keep the war's growing scale hidden from the American public and from Congress, approved a series of troop increases in secret. In April, he authorized another 40,000. In July, after a series of intense meetings with his advisors, he made the final, fateful decision. He would not call up the reserves, an act that would have signaled a national commitment to a major war and sparked a public debate he desperately wanted to avoid. Instead, he would rely on the draft, sending a steady stream of young men to Vietnam. He went on television and announced he was increasing the number of American troops in Vietnam to 125,000, with more to follow as requested by General Westmoreland. He presented the decision not as a major escalation, but as a continuation of an existing policy. He spoke of America's commitment to defending a small nation from aggression. He said, "We will not be defeated. We will not grow tired. We will not withdraw, either openly or under the cloak of a meaningless agreement." He had crossed the Rubicon. The war was now America's war. George Ball's prediction had come true. America was on the tiger's back. The decision was not made in a single dramatic moment of crisis. It was a gradual slide, a series of incremental steps, each one seeming logical and necessary at the time. It was a commitment made in relative secrecy, without a full and honest debate. The Johnson administration, convinced of its own righteousness and the invincibility of American power, had led the nation into a war of attrition against a determined and resilient enemy in a place they did not understand. They had no clear strategy for victory, only a vague hope that American firepower would eventually force the other side to give up. They had passed the point of no return. The small advisory effort of the Kennedy years had metastasized into a massive military intervention. The limited war had become an open-ended commitment. The ghosts of Pleiku and the Gulf of Tonkin had been fully exorcised by the boots of American soldiers marching into the jungles of Southeast Asia. The nightmare was no longer on the horizon. It was here. Chapter 6. The Grinding Machine. With the arrival of combat troops in 1965, the Vietnam War transformed into a brutal grinding machine. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition demanded that his soldiers go out and find the enemy, engage them, and kill them. This was the era of the search and destroy mission, the defining tactical operation of the American war. The theory was simple. American forces would use their superior mobility, primarily helicopters, to descend on suspected enemy strongholds, surround them, and eliminate them. Success would be measured by the daily body count, the grim arithmetic that Robert McNamara and the Pentagon believed would chart the path to victory. But the reality on the ground was a far cry from the clean logic of the strategy. Vietnam was a war without fronts, a war where the enemy was elusive and the battlefield was everywhere. A typical search and destroy mission began at dawn. Helicopters, the iconic Hueys, would clatter into a landing zone, a hastily cleared patch of jungle, or a dry rice paddy. The infantrymen, the grunts, would pour out, weighed down by heavy packs, rifles, and ammunition, and immediately fan out into the jungle or the surrounding villages. The heat was a physical presence, a suffocating weight that drained a man's strength. The landscape itself was hostile. Razor-sharp elephant grass could cut through fatigues and skin. The jungles were a disorienting maze of triple canopy foliage that blocked out the sun. The soldiers moved through this alien world with a constant, gnawing fear. The enemy was rarely seen. They announced their presence with a sudden burst of automatic weapons fire from a concealed bunker, a single sniper shot from a treetop, or the terrifying explosion of a booby trap. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage and concealment. They laced the landscape with deadly traps, tripwires connected to grenades, pits filled with sharpened bamboo stakes called punji sticks, and mines made from unexploded American bombs. The fear of these hidden killers was a constant psychological burden, forcing the soldiers to move slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning every inch of the trail ahead. A moment of inattention could mean a lost leg or a life. When contact was made, the firefights were sudden, violent, and terrifyingly chaotic. The idyllic landscape would erupt into a maelstrom of noise and fury. The distinctive crack of the enemy's AK-47 SE, the heavier retort of the American M16 SE, the thud of grenade launchers, the screams of the wounded. The soldiers would dive for cover, seeking shelter behind a tree, a termite mound, a paddy dike. They fought with a primal desperation, their training kicking in, laying down a wall of fire in the direction of an enemy they often couldn't see. Then, the call would go out for air support. Fighter jets would roar overhead, dropping napalm, a jellied gasoline that clung to everything it touched, creating an inferno of unimaginable heat. Artillery batteries miles away would rain down high explosive shells. The sheer destructive power the Americans could bring to bear was awesome, capable of obliterating entire patches of jungle. But often, by the time the bombs and shells fell, the enemy had already slipped away, vanishing back into their network of tunnels and secret trails. The body count became the sole measure of success. After a firefight, the grim task of counting the dead began. But who was a Viet Cong soldier, and who was an innocent civilian? In a guerrilla war, the lines were hopelessly blurred. A dead man with a weapon was a confirmed enemy kill. A dead man without one might be counted anyway, to inflate the numbers and make the operation look like a success. This pressure to produce bodies led to tragic and brutal consequences. Villages that were suspected of supporting the Viet Cong were often designated as free fire zones, where anything that moved was considered a legitimate target. Huts were burned, livestock killed, and civilians caught in the crossfire. The strategy of attrition meant to wear down the enemy's army ended up alienating the very people whose hearts and minds the Americans were supposed to be winning. The first major clash between American and North Vietnamese regular forces occurred in November 1965, in the Ia Drang Valley, in the Central Highlands. It was a brutal 4-day battle that served as a preview of the entire war. The 1st Cavalry Division, an airmobile unit, was sent into the valley to find and destroy NVA regiments that had been attacking a Special Forces camp. They landed at a clearing designated Landing Zone X-Ray. They were immediately surrounded and attacked by a force of over 2,000 NVA soldiers. The fighting at LZ X-Ray was desperate and at close quarters. The American troopers, heavily outnumbered, formed a tight defensive perimeter and fought for their lives. They depended on a constant stream of helicopters flying in ammunition and reinforcements, and flying out the wounded, often under intense fire. The battle was saved by overwhelming American air and artillery support. B-52 bombers were called in for the first time in a tactical support role, dropping their massive payloads on the NVA positions with devastating effect. After 3 days, the NVA, having suffered horrific casualties, withdrew. The Americans had held their ground. A few days later, as another American battalion was marching from LZ X-Ray to another landing zone, they were ambushed in a clearing called LZ Albany. The fighting was a chaotic hand-to-hand slaughter. In a few short hours, the battalion was decimated. The Ia Drang Valley was, in a sense, a victory for both sides. The Americans had inflicted enormous casualties on the North Vietnamese, killing perhaps 10 times as many as they lost. Westmoreland and McNamara saw this as proof that the strategy of attrition would work. The body count was favorable, but the North Vietnamese also drew a lesson. They had learned they could control the tempo of the fighting. They could choose when and where to engage the Americans, inflict casualties, and then withdraw to their sanctuaries before American firepower could destroy them. They learned that they could neutralize America's technological superiority by getting in close to the belt of the American soldiers, making it impossible for them to call in air and artillery support without hitting their own men. The war settled into this bloody pattern. For the next 2 years, from 1966 through 1967, the grinding machine churned on. Large-scale operations with names like Attleboro, Cedar Falls, and Junction City saw tens of thousands of American troops sweep through vast areas of countryside trying to corner the enemy. They found and destroyed huge tunnel complexes and supply caches. They killed thousands of enemy soldiers, but they never managed to land a decisive blow. The enemy always seemed to regenerate. For every soldier killed, another seemed to rise up and take his place. The body count climbed into the tens, then hundreds of thousands. The number of American troops swelled to nearly 500,000. The tonnage of bombs dropped on Vietnam surpassed the total dropped in all of World War II, but the war seemed no closer to an end. Back home, the American public was being told that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Officials spoke of progress, of enemy morale cracking, of the crossover point being reached. But the television news each night told a different story. It brought the brutal reality of the war into American living rooms for the first time in history. The images of firefights, of wounded soldiers, of burning villages, began to contradict the official optimism. A credibility gap began to open between what the government was saying and what the people were seeing. The grinding machine was not just chewing up bodies in Vietnam. It was beginning to chew up the consensus and confidence of a nation. The war was becoming a stalemate, a bloody war of attrition where the only certainty was that more young men on both sides would continue to be fed into its unforgiving gears, and the worst was yet to come. Chapter 7. The Shock of Tet. By the end of 1967, the Johnson administration launched a full-scale public relations campaign to shore up dwindling support for the war. General Westmoreland was brought back to Washington to address the nation. He spoke at the National Press Club, exuding confidence. He declared that the enemy was certainly losing, and that the U.S. had reached a point where the end begins to come into view. He painted a picture of an enemy on the ropes, exhausted and demoralized. The administration's message was clear. The strategy was working, victory was on the horizon. It was perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation of the entire war. In the jungles and cities of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were preparing for their most ambitious offensive yet. General Giap and the Hanoi leadership had decided to risk everything on a single, massive gamble. They would launch a surprise, simultaneous attack on virtually every city and major town in South Vietnam. Their goal was not to win a conventional military victory. They knew that was impossible. The true goal was psychological. They aimed to shatter the illusion of American progress, to prove that no part of South Vietnam was secure. They hoped to ignite a general uprising among the South Vietnamese people, who they believed would rise up and overthrow the Saigon government. And most importantly, they wanted to strike a decisive blow against the American will to fight, to convince the American public and its leaders that the war was unwinnable. The chosen date was the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most sacred festival in their culture. In previous years, an informal truce had been observed during Tet. The North Vietnamese counted on this to achieve maximum surprise. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, tens of thousands of Viet Cong and NVA soldiers began to infiltrate the southern cities. They came disguised as peasants visiting family, their weapons hidden in carts of vegetables, in coffins, in hollowed-out logs. They moved silently, secretly, a phantom army assembling under the very noses of the American and South Vietnamese intelligence services. On the morning of January 30th, 1968, the offensive began. The scale and ferocity of the attacks were stunning. More than 80,000 enemy troops struck over 100 different targets, from the Mekong Delta in the south to the demilitarized zone in the north. They blasted their way into provincial capitals, district towns, and military bases. The fighting was savage, often house to house, in places that had never before seen combat. But the most shocking attack of all occurred in the heart of the capital, Saigon. A small team of 19 Viet Cong commandos blew a hole in the outer wall of the United States Embassy, a gleaming, modern fortress that was supposed to be the most secure building in the country. They stormed into the compound, firing automatic weapons. For 6 terrifying hours, they held a section of the embassy grounds, engaged in a fierce firefight with American military police and Marines, who were rushed to the scene. The commandos never made it into the main Chancery building, and by morning, all of them were dead or captured. But the damage was done. The image of American soldiers fighting for control of their own embassy, broadcast live on television, was a devastating psychological blow. It made the administration's claims of progress look like a deliberate lie. If the enemy could strike at the very symbol of American power in Vietnam, how could any place be considered safe? Another major battle raged in the ancient imperial capital of Hue. Thousands of NVA and Viet Cong soldiers seized control of the city's historic citadel and held it for nearly a month. The battle to retake Hue was one of the bloodiest of the war. Marines and RVN soldiers had to fight for every single block, every house, in brutal, close-quarters combat. The beautiful, historic city was reduced to rubble. After the city was finally recaptured, a horrific discovery was made. The communists had systematically rounded up and executed thousands of civilians, government officials, intellectuals, priests, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the people. The massacre at Hue was a stark reminder of the brutality of the enemy, the Americans were fighting. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic defeat for the Communists. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked. They did not spark a popular uprising. In fact, the offensive's brutality may have turned many South Vietnamese against them. Their casualties were astronomical, perhaps as many as 50,000 men killed, a loss that crippled the Viet Cong for the rest of the war. But strategically, Tet was a stunning victory for North Vietnam. It completely shattered the American public's confidence in the war. The nightly news was filled with images of chaos, of American soldiers fighting in the streets of cities that were supposedly secure. The credibility of the Johnson administration was destroyed. The question on everyone's lips was, if the enemy was so close to defeat, as we were told, how could they have mounted an offensive of this scale? The most influential voice in American journalism at the time was Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News. He was a trusted fatherly figure, often called the most trusted man in America. After the Tet Offensive, Cronkite decided to go to Vietnam to see the situation for himself. He returned and delivered a televised editorial that would become a landmark moment in the history of the war. He concluded his report with a somber personal commentary. He declared that it seemed more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. He urged the government to negotiate a way out. In the White House, Lyndon Johnson watched the broadcast. He reportedly turned to his aides and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The political fallout was swift and decisive. General Westmoreland requested another 206,000 troops to finish the job, a request that was leaked to the press and caused a political firestorm. Johnson, now besieged by anti-war protests and facing challenges for the presidential nomination from within his own party, knew his presidency was broken. On March 31, 1968, he went on national television. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and his willingness to enter into peace negotiations. And then, he delivered a bombshell that stunned the nation. He said, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The man who had committed America to the war, the man who had vowed he would not be the first president to lose a war, was effectively surrendering. The Tet Offensive had not defeated the American army in the field, but it had decisively defeated the American president in the corridors of power and in the court of public opinion. The shock of Tet had turned the tide. It proved that a military victory as defined by Westmoreland was not possible. The war would drag on for years more, but after Tet, the central question was no longer how to win, but how to get out. The grinding machine had been broken, not by force of arms but by the force of a single devastating psychological blow. Chapter 8. A Nation Divided. The year 1968 was a crucible, a year when all the simmering tensions in American society boiled over. The Tet Offensive acted as a catalyst, transforming the war in Vietnam from a distant conflict into the central, agonizing issue of American life. The nation, it seemed, was coming apart at the seams. Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race threw the political landscape into chaos. His decision was a stunning admission that his war policy had failed. The anti-war movement, which had been growing for years, was now energized and emboldened. It had started on college campuses among students who saw the war as immoral and unjust. It questioned the Cold War logic that had led America into Vietnam. They were outraged by the draft, which they saw as an unfair system that sent the poor and working class to fight while the sons of the privileged found deferments. The protests grew larger and more confrontational. They marched on the Pentagon, burned their draft cards, and chanted slogans that became the soundtrack of the era. "Hey hey LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" But the anti-war movement was not a monolith. It was a complex coalition of pacifists, students, clergy, and civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr., who had initially been reluctant to speak out against the war for fear of alienating President Johnson, his ally on civil rights, finally broke his silence in 1967. In a powerful speech titled "Beyond Vietnam," he called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He argued that the war was not only a moral catastrophe, but also a betrayal of the fight against poverty at home, draining resources and attention from the Great Society programs. His assassination on April 4, 1968, sent a shockwave of grief and anger across the country, igniting riots in over 100 cities. The nation felt like it was teetering on the brink of anarchy. The war was now inextricably linked with the struggle for racial justice. Black leaders pointed out the cruel irony that African American soldiers were dying in disproportionate numbers to defend the freedom of the South Vietnamese, while they were still denied basic freedoms at home. The boxer Muhammad Ali famously refused to be drafted, declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." His defiance made him a hero to many, and a traitor to others. The divisions in the country were deep and bitter. It was a generational conflict, pitting the young against their elders. It was a class conflict, pitting those who fought against those who did not. It was a cultural conflict, pitting the counterculture with its long hair and rock music against the traditional values of Middle America. The supporters of the war, often called the silent majority, were equally passionate. They saw the protesters as spoiled, unpatriotic cowards who were betraying the soldiers fighting overseas. They believed in the cause of stopping communism. They saw the American flag not as a symbol of imperialism, but of freedom and sacrifice. The bumper stickers on their cars read, "America, love it or leave it." The country was fragmenting into two hostile camps, unable to speak the same language or agree on the same set of facts. This national nervous breakdown came to a head in August 1968, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. As the party delegates gathered inside the convention hall to nominate a new presidential candidate, thousands of anti-war protesters converged on the city. The mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley, was determined to maintain order at all costs. He turned his city into an armed camp, mobilizing thousands of police officers and National Guardsmen. The result was a week of chaos and violence that was broadcast live to a horrified nation. The police brutally attacked the protesters in the streets, clubbing them with nightsticks, using tear gas, in what a later investigation would call a police riot. Inside the convention hall, the Democratic Party was tearing itself apart. The chaotic, violent images from Chicago sealed the party's fate in the upcoming election. The Republican nominee was Richard Nixon, a man who had built his career as a staunch anti-communist. But he was also a shrewd political operator who understood that the country was desperate for an end to the war. He campaigned on a promise to bring peace with honor. He claimed to have a secret plan to end the war, though he never specified what it was. He appealed to the silent majority, the law-abiding, patriotic Americans, who were tired of the protests, the riots, and the social upheaval. In November, Nixon won the presidency. He inherited a nation more deeply divided than at any time since the Civil War, and a war that had no clear path to victory. The divisions were not just on the streets of America, they were also in the jungles of Vietnam. The morale of the American troops plummeted after the Tet Offensive. They had been told they were winning, and then they had to fight for their lives in the cities. The sense of purpose that had existed in the early years of the war began to evaporate. The soldiers knew that their government was now negotiating an exit. They were no longer fighting to win, but simply to survive their one-year tour. This led to a breakdown in discipline. Drug use, particularly marijuana and heroin, became rampant. Racial tensions, mirroring the conflicts back home, flared up between black and white soldiers. In the most extreme cases, a practice known as fragging emerged, where enlisted men would assassinate their own officers if they felt the officer was needlessly endangering their lives. The war had turned inward on itself. The most infamous event of this period occurred in March of 1968, though it would not become public knowledge for another year and a half. A company of American soldiers from the American Division entered a small village called My Lai. They were on a search and destroy mission, and had been told that the village was a Viet Cong stronghold and that all civilians would be gone. They found only old men, women, and children. In a frenzy of rage and frustration, the soldiers rounded up the unarmed villagers and systematically murdered them. Over 500 people were killed. The My Lai massacre was an aberration, but it became a horrifying symbol of the war's dehumanizing brutality. When the story finally broke, it sent another shockwave through the American public, further fueling the anti-war movement and deepening the nation's sense of shame and disillusionment. The nation was sick of the war, but the question remained, how to get out. A simple withdrawal was politically impossible for Nixon. It would look like a surrender, and so the war would continue, the killing would continue, and the nation's wounds would continue to fester. The dream of a great society had been consumed by the fires of a war that had not only divided a small country in Southeast Asia, but had also turned America against itself. Chapter 9. The Long Goodbye. Richard Nixon's presidency was defined by a central paradox. He was elected to end the war, but he would spend his first term dramatically expanding it before finally negotiating a withdrawal. His strategy was a complex and often contradictory mix of diplomacy, deception, and brutal military force. He called his policy Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually withdraw American troops while simultaneously building up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, so that it could stand on its own against the communists. It was, in essence, a policy of changing the color of the corpses. The goal was to create what Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, called a decent interval, a period of time between the final American withdrawal and the potential collapse of the South Vietnamese government. This would allow the United States to exit without the immediate appearance of a humiliating defeat. To make this strategy work, Nixon believed he had to convince Hanoi that he was unpredictable, even irrational. He called it the madman theory. He wanted the North Vietnamese to believe he was capable of anything, even using nuclear weapons, to force them to the negotiating table on his terms. In March of 1969, Nixon, without informing the American public or Congress, authorized a secret bombing campaign against North Vietnamese sanctuaries in neighboring Cambodia. For the next 14 months, American B-52 Seth flew thousands of sorties, dropping over 100,000 tons of bombs on a neutral country. The bombing was kept secret through a system of false flight logs and clandestine reporting. It was a massive, illegal deception. While the bombs fell on Cambodia, the withdrawal of American troops began. The first contingent left in the summer of 1969. For the soldiers remaining in Vietnam, Vietnamization was a confusing and demoralizing process. Their mission was no longer to win the war, but to provide a shield for the withdrawing forces, and to train the ARVN. They were fighting a holding action in a war that their own country was trying to forget. The anti-war movement at home, however, was not placated by the slow pace of withdrawal. In the fall of 1969, the largest anti-war protests in American history took place, with millions participating in the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. Nixon felt besieged, convinced that the protests were undermining his negotiating position with Hanoi. He went on television and delivered his famous silent majority speech, appealing directly to the patriotic Americans who he believed supported his policies. But his actions would soon provoke an even greater firestorm of protest. In April of 1970, Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese forces had launched an incursion into Cambodia. The goal was to destroy the North Vietnamese command centers and supply depots that the secret bombing had failed to eliminate. Nixon portrayed the invasion as a necessary step to protect American troops and speed up the end of the war. But to many Americans, it looked like a shocking escalation, a widening of the conflict into a new country. The reaction on college campuses was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted across the nation. At Kent State University in Ohio, the governor called in the National Guard to quell the demonstrations. On May 4, 1970, a contingent of guardsmen, feeling threatened by a group of student protesters, opened fire. In 13 seconds, they fired dozens of rounds into the crowd. 4 students were killed, 9 were wounded. 2 of the dead were not even part of the protest. They were simply walking to class. 10 days later, at Jackson State College in Mississippi, police opened fire on a student dormitory, killing 2 more students. The Kent State and Jackson State killings sent a shudder through the nation. It seemed that the war had finally come home, that the violence of Vietnam was now being turned on America's own children. The country was more polarized than ever. While the war expanded into Cambodia, Henry Kissinger was engaged in secret peace talks in Paris with his North Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Thu. The negotiations were a long, arduous process, a chess match between 2 brilliant and determined adversaries. The central sticking point was the political future of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese demanded the removal of the South Vietnamese president, Nguyen Van Thieu, and the creation of a coalition government that would include the Viet Cong. The United States refused, insisting that the Thieu government remain in place. As the talks stalled, the fighting continued. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched another massive conventional invasion of the South, the Easter Offensive. They threw tanks and artillery across the demilitarized zone, hoping to score a decisive victory. The ARVN, with the help of massive American air power, managed to beat back the offensive, but not before suffering heavy casualties. The Easter Offensive proved 2 things: that the ARVN could fight, but that it was still completely dependent on American air support to survive. In the fall of 1972, with another presidential election looming, Kissinger and Le Duc Thu finally achieved a breakthrough. They hammered out a draft peace agreement. The United States agreed to a complete withdrawal of its troops in exchange for the return of all American prisoners of war. Crucially, the agreement allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South, a huge concession that virtually guaranteed the eventual demise of the Thieu government. Kissinger flew back to Washington, and just weeks before the election announced, "Peace is at hand." But President Thieu in Saigon was furious. He felt he had been betrayed. He rejected the agreement, refusing to sign a deal that would leave enemy troops on his soil. Nixon, having won a resounding re-election, decided he had to force both sides to accept the terms. To placate Thieu and show American resolve, he unleashed the most intense bombing campaign of the entire war. In December 1972, for 11 days, American B-52s dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. It was called the Christmas bombing. The bombing was brutal and controversial, but it achieved its objective. The North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table, and with a combination of threats and promises of continued military aid, Nixon forced a reluctant President Thieu to accept the agreement. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were officially signed. The war for America was finally over. The last American combat troops left Vietnam 2 months later. The prisoners of war, some of whom had been held captive for years in brutal conditions, finally came home. Their return was a moment of genuine joy and relief for a weary nation, but the peace that had been negotiated was a fragile one. It was, as one observer called it, a decent interval. The agreement left the two warring Vietnamese armies in place, a recipe for a continued civil war. Nixon had promised Thieu that the United States would respond with full force if North Vietnam violated the agreement. But Nixon's presidency was about to be consumed by the Watergate scandal. By 1974, he was forced to resign. The new president, Gerald Ford, faced a Congress that was determined to never again get involved in Vietnam. They passed legislation cutting off all funding for military action in Indochina. The long goodbye was over. South Vietnam was now on its own. The decent interval was about to expire, and the final tragic act of the Vietnam War was about to begin. Chapter 10. Ghosts of a Fallen City. The peace promised by the Paris Accords was a mirage. For 2 years after the American withdrawal, a tense and violent standoff persisted in Vietnam. The Civil War simmered, with both sides violating the ceasefire. But without American air power, and with dwindling U.S. aid, the balance of power was shifting decisively in favor of the North. The South Vietnamese army, though well-equipped, was plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and collapsing morale. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese leadership decided the time was right for the final offensive. They expected the campaign to take 2 years. It took 55 days. The offensive began in the Central Highlands and quickly turned into a rout. The ARVN disintegrated, its soldiers abandoning their posts, shedding their uniforms, and melting into the terrified crowds of civilians fleeing southward. City after city fell with barely a fight. President Thieu, in a panic, ordered a strategic withdrawal that turned into a chaotic and bloody stampede known as the Convoy of Tears. The North Vietnamese army, stunned by the speed of the collapse, raced towards its ultimate prize, Saigon. In Washington, the Ford administration watched in helpless disbelief. Congress refused to authorize any last-minute military aid. The war was over for America, and there was no political will to re-engage. The only remaining task was to evacuate the last Americans still in the country: diplomats, intelligence agents, contractors, and as many of their South Vietnamese allies as possible. The final days of Saigon were a portrait of desperation and chaos. The city was gripped by fear. The airport was shelled and closed. The only way out was by helicopter from the roof of the American embassy. The evacuation, codenamed Operation Frequent Wind, became a frantic, heartbreaking race against time. Huge crowds of terrified South Vietnamese swarmed the embassy walls, waving papers, begging for a place on one of the helicopters. They were the ones who had thrown their lot in with the Americans. Government officials, military officers, translators, their families. They knew that a communist victory would mean prison, re-education camps, or even death. The images are seared into history. American Marines using their rifle butts to push back the desperate crowds. A helicopter perched precariously on a rooftop. A line of people climbing a ladder to get aboard. It was a chaotic and ignominious end to America's 30-year involvement in Vietnam. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, the last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof. Just hours later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of Saigon, crashing through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over. For the Vietnamese, the end of the war did not bring peace and prosperity. The victorious communists imposed a harsh, totalitarian regime. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese were sent to brutal re-education camps. The economy collapsed. In the years that followed, millions of boat people fled the country in rickety, overcrowded boats, risking storms and pirates in a desperate search for freedom. The war's devastation extended beyond Vietnam. In Cambodia, Nixon's secret bombing and invasion had destabilized the country, creating a power vacuum that was filled by the Khmer Rouge, a genocidal communist regime that would go on to murder nearly 2 million of its own people in the infamous killing fields. For the United States, the return of the soldiers was not a moment of celebration. There were no victory parades. The veterans came home one by one to a nation that was deeply divided and wanted to forget the war. They were often met with indifference, and sometimes with hostility. They carried the physical and psychological scars of a war that their country did not understand and did not want to acknowledge. They suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition not yet recognized by the medical establishment. They struggled with addiction, unemployment, and a profound sense of alienation. The war left a deep and lasting wound on the American psyche. It shattered the post-World War II consensus and the belief in American invincibility and moral righteousness. It bred a deep distrust of government and authority. The Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to commit American military power abroad, would shape U.S. foreign policy for decades. The total cost was staggering. Nearly 60,000 Americans were killed. More than 300,000 were wounded. On the Vietnamese side, the losses were orders of magnitude greater. As many as 2 million civilians on both sides, and over 1 million communist soldiers were killed. The land itself was scarred, poisoned by millions of tons of bombs and chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, whose toxic legacy would affect the health of generations to come. In 1982, a memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. It was not a heroic statue of soldiers raising a flag. It was a simple, stark wall of polished black granite, designed by a young architectural student named Maya Lin. Cut into the stone are the names of the 58,279 Americans who died in the war. The wall is a quiet, powerful place. It descends into the earth, a wound in the landscape. Visitors walk along its length, seeing their own reflections superimposed on the endless list of names. They reach out and touch a name, a father, a son, a brother, a friend. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is not a monument to victory or glory. It is a monument to sacrifice and loss. It does not seek to explain the war or to justify it. It simply bears witness to its human cost. The story of the Vietnam War is a tragedy, a story of noble intentions and catastrophic consequences, of political arrogance and human endurance, of courage and cruelty. It is a reminder that war is a profoundly human endeavor, driven by fear, pride, and ideology, and that its costs are always measured in individual lives. The ghosts of that fallen city and of the jungles and rice paddies still linger. They serve as a solemn, enduring lesson, a nightmare from which America has yet to fully awaken.